All right, excellent. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Emmy and I'm going to be hosting this session for you guys on how to market yourself and find a job when you're moving to a new country. Now, I'm not quite sure where you guys are coming from and where you guys are going to. Knowing that I'm based in Australia, I do assume that a few of you on the call might very well be in Australia or coming to Australia. If that is the case, I can certainly spend a bit of time more specifically talking about Australia. So as and when we go through this chat, we're going to be on the call for about an hour. Hopefully you can stay for the whole time. Please do put little questions or things that come up for you into the chat box so that I can answer your specific questions. If it's a longer question, by all means, we can take it after the call. But don't be afraid to ask. There are no stupid questions when it comes to this sort of stuff. So quickly about me, a few of you may or may not have been following the Bridge Easy Relocation for a little while, but my name is Emmy. I have spent the last 14 plus years overseas, either traveling or moving, and I have lived in quite a few places by now. So I've lived in the US for an extended period of time on my first long trip overseas. After that, I lived in the UK for quite a while, and I've been here in Australia now since 2010. And I was born and raised in Sweden. And by now, what we're going to focus on today and what I get a lot of questions from my clients about is specifically around work and how to actually not just find a random job and be able to pay your travel costs, but maybe even find a job that actually excites you. So my travels have taken me many different places. If you would have asked me 10 years ago where I'd be living, I hardly think I would have said Australia. And that's kind of the cool thing about, just one second, I think we might be having a little bit of a drawing there on the screen. That's totally fine. So, but my background is, as you might have heard, is about coaching and specifically focusing on relocation and people who move overseas. So my journey, I started in Sweden, and I lived in Sweden until I was about 19 years old. And then I went over to the US, lived in San Francisco, had a fantastic year over there as a nanny. Now, working as a nanny there was quite specific because it was, one of those things where, a lot of the work was organized for me. I applied through an au pair agency. And if anyone on the call today are interested in doing that type of work, I can certainly give you some more specific details around that. But what I wanted to focus today was more around other types of work. So if you are a backpacker calling in, you can absolutely use all the tips that you're going to get in the call today from me, no doubt. It's really going to help you get a job. If you're actually looking to get another type of job, I'm going to touch quickly now on how I went about it in the UK, as well as in when I first arrived in Australia, and how I advanced my career in the way that I did, not being from here originally. So I started out in the UK. So I finished my studies in Sweden at university, and I actually, believe it or not, ended up studying political science. And political science, I was very interested in international relations, etc. And I did a short stint in the UK as part of my exchange studies. But I arrived in the UK back in 2007, and at the time, my partner had a pretty good job, and I kind of followed him along over there. And I wanted to find a job that would either be in line with my studies or at least quite rewarding in some way. So what I did though, and I had actually done a little bit of research before I arrived in the UK. So what I did is I actually registered with a temp agency or an admin agency, because I realized that probably what I wanted more than anything was to find a job so I could start integrating into a workforce, have a reference locally in the UK who could give me a job reference, even if it was just a temporary job for a few weeks, and that sort of stuff. So what I did was, at the same time as I signed up with a temp agency, so they can be called a recruitment agency, temporary work recruitment agency. There are many different names for it, so it just depends a little bit where you're going. This chat today is obviously based on English-speaking countries. If you are going to other countries, you might just need to do a little bit of research what it's called there. What I did as well, which actually landed me the best job I had in the UK, was that I filled in a quite detailed online job profile. So here in Australia, we have seek.com.au. In the UK at the time, they had something called monster.co.uk. And I'm sure wherever in the world you're going, there is one or two main job search sites in that country. But what I did is I filled in a pretty detailed profile on monster.co.uk. And what I actually did, which not a lot of people realize is important, is I filled in my language skills, which was ironic because after only, my apologies, something happening here to the webinar system. So, but what ended up happening quite ironically is that I actually ended up being headhunted for a job because of my Swedish skills, because I was able to speak Swedish. So that was quite interesting. And I actually ended up working for a Scandinavian bank over in the UK as a result of this. So don't underestimate putting your profile online and filling out all those detailed gazillion pages that they ask for, because in my case, that was actually what landed that call and that interview. So I had a temporary job within about 2 weeks at an office where I just basically did some appointment setting and very, very, very basic office skills. And within a month, I was actually working for a Scandinavian bank, not necessarily in the political science field, but a lot more relevant and a lot more engaging, which also kept me connected to my home country of Sweden, which is really cool. And but then I stayed in the UK for quite a while, and the interesting thing as well is that I realized that it was very rainy and it started to get a bit cold, and I'd been over in the UK from 2007. So in 2010, a friend of mine and I said that we were going to go traveling around the world. We had this grand plan that we were going to go around the world in 12 months and then come back to Europe and grow up. And the funny thing is, I actually never did go back to Europe. I've been over here for over 6 years now. And the job was actually one of the many things that allowed me to stay in this beautiful country, and I'll share more with you in a moment. So I went to Australia. And so in 2010, I arrived in Australia, and as many backpackers can probably relate to, I arrived here on a work and holiday visa. Now, depending on what country you're going to, you may or may not need a visa. In the UK, I certainly didn't need a visa because obviously I had a European passport. But in some countries you will. So like in Australia, if you're coming from Europe to Australia, you will need a specific visa that allows you to work. And it's really important that you know the rules of your visa, because your future employer might not be as skilled as you are. So I landed in Australia on a work and holiday visa, had traveled a little bit through Asia and realized that I was starting to run out of money. So my motivation at the time for finding work was very much reactive. And looking back at it now, I wish I would have been a little bit more proactive. But what happened for me in Sydney is that I applied for a lot of online jobs. So I hopped on seek.com.au and career1.com.au. And I was looking at all these jobs and I was just applying for anything that kind of looked like admin or secretarial or something that I would qualify for. And the interesting thing is that because I applied for this large volume of jobs, I actually ended up getting an interview with a temp admin agency within about a week of landing in Sydney. And I was lucky that that interview was for a large corporation, so actually a pretty big company. At the time, it was actually pure luck. I didn't know that it was a very big company. And originally, it was only a 2-week role to cover someone who was going to go away on her honeymoon. So I managed to get in, but the interesting thing with this company, and actually I have this company to thank for a lot of things. So because I was on a work and holiday visa, I had restrictions on how long I could work for them. But the thing is, I didn't really allow that to limit my engagement. So I learned as much as I could about that company. I started interacting with people in different departments. I started to really get to know the company, all the different divisions. And even though the job I was in at the time wasn't my dream job, I looked at it and I went, this is a big company. They may be able to help sponsor me so I can stay in Australia if I should choose to do so. And you need to be really curious and really go out and show to this new workplace, even if you're just temping, which a lot of you on this call might be doing at some point. So really show them what you can do, show them the skills that you have without being arrogant, without being cocky. Just go in there and show them what you can do. And even if you're in an area, like in my case, this wasn't quite exactly what I wanted to do, but this large company was actually working in the media industry. And I knew that I wanted to do something related to marketing, sales, or media, or all of the above. So I thought to myself, if I can find a way of staying in this company and getting them to sponsor me in a role that's interesting enough, I will be able to advance and I will be able to move departments and do some other things. So I was very, very lucky because in the first 6 months of me working with them, they loved me. I got moved around to a few different departments. I got to do a few jobs that were not necessarily my dream jobs, but I met a lot of people, and I was very lucky to come across the manager of HR at this time. And I will say the only reason I came across this guy is my curiosity and my general attitude to always talk to people, to find out more about what they do, socialize with people. I was never one of those people who come in, do my job, and just go home. And in the beginning, it can be hard because you're coming into a work environment or an office environment that can be quite structured, you know, where people know each other from way back when, and you feel like the outsider. And not only are you an outsider, you're also international. So I just started networking, and I was lucky because they ended up saying, hey, Emmy, we really like your work, and we've got this position coming up. I was in Sydney at the time, and this position was based in Melbourne. And they said, well, if you can be in Melbourne by this date and interview for this job, we can pretty much guarantee you get the job. And if so, we'll proceed with your sponsorship visa. So I was very, very fortunate. But again, the reason that this happened is because I kept my eyes very much open and I kept talking to people. And I also kept saying to people what I was interested in, you know, particular things that I enjoyed, you know, like that I liked the sales aspect. I really enjoyed project management, you know, and I got to do some really interesting skill development courses in that role. So I went from a temporary office admin and kind of a secretary to a project manager. And in the time as a project manager, I sort of got also half promoted into a role as account executive. So I was helping out with some of the larger national accounts. And it's not until later on I realized what a big step that was, and how those opportunities seemed to land on my lap. But the interesting thing, I choose to believe that I wasn't lucky. There were a few things that I very deliberately did. And yes, if I could go back now and do it again, I would have probably done it even more effectively, which is why we're having this conversation today. So we're going to go into a bit more examples here, but I'm just going to quickly have a look and see if anyone has any questions here. No, I think we're all good. Excellent. So the common question that I get from a lot of people is do you line up the job or do you decide where to move first? This is a really big question, and depending again where you're going to and from, if you're coming to Australia, which I know that a few of you here on the call probably are, you need to understand that if you're coming from Europe or the US to Australia, you probably need to decide if you're willing to make this move before you secure the job. In a very small percentage of people have the job lined up before they come. That typically happens if you work in a very specific field, like if you're an engineer or something quite specific. And then it's not too uncommon for people to be sponsored already from your home country, like from the UK or Sweden, etc., to come to Australia and work in a specific company in a specific role for a dedicated amount of time. If you're anything like me and just kind of land over here, realize that you really like it, realize that you'll need to find a way of staying, you need to come with sufficient funds. You need to come with some savings, and you need to come with some ideas, which we'll talk about later. So I would say it is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but actually I would say, you know, do your research, have your intention of the country you want to go to, and the job. More often than not, if you're a pretty savvy person and if you apply the things we're going to go through today, you are going to get that job working for you on the other side. Also want to say hi to a few people who've just joined us on the call. Really, really welcome. My name is Emmy. And I forgot to say at the start to everyone, actually, you're going to get the full recording of this. So you can take as many notes as you want, but I'm going to give you the full recording of all of these slides and everything. So you can look at it after the call in your own time. So if I'm talking too fast or sharing too much, you can go back and listen as many times as you need to. Awesome. Cool. Oh yeah, a few people happy about getting the recording. That's good. Always record everything you do. That's my motto. Where was I? Yes. So with the job or the move first. So the thing I will say is be really mindful of a few things when you decide as well about the country you're going to. Language skills is a pretty vital thing. So you need to be quite mindful where you're going, what the language is in that country, if you are proficient at all in that language. And if you're not, you probably have to be a little bit more realistic about how you line yourself up for work. In Australia specifically, and also some other countries like Canada and the US, etc., if you're coming from Europe with a European passport, we're quite used to very flexible, open working arrangements. But in reality, in some countries, it is a lot harder than that. A lot of people who come to Australia are not quite prepared for how it's going to work. What I will say, if you have a very specific skill set and you're unsure if it's what type of work visa to apply for, etc., I would really recommend you to speak to a migration agent. Now, a migration agent is not employed by the government. They are employed by various migration companies. So a registered migration agent is accredited by the Australian government or the US government or wherever you are. And they have sufficient training in how the different visas apply. If you're going to a country like the US or Australia where it's quite complicated to understand the different visas, it can be worth to pay a small amount of, say, $100 or $200 to have a consultation with someone specifically about your situation, because then you'll get the exact details of how that's going to work. Cool. And the other thing that I always say to people as well is, if you're thinking about applying for a job from back home before you've even arrived, you need to be really mindful. And I will dare you to do this. Imagine that you were in their shoes. So I see a lot of people, especially Scandinavians, coming to Australia in different forums saying, hey, can I apply for a job before I've even gotten there? Yes, technically you could. You could hop on the main work job application websites and start applying for jobs. But the moment they see on your CV that you don't have an Australian address yet, that you're not actually on site in Australia with an Australian phone number and available for an interview, if you were them, would you invite that person to an interview? You probably would most definitely want to meet them first. And in some circumstances, if you are going as an au pair, for example, you may very well have Skype interviews, but it's quite unusual to have interviews like that over Skype or over the phone. So think about, if you were them, if you were the employer at the other end, would you hire someone that you had never met? Would you hire someone that had qualifications that you didn't recognize from a university that you'd never heard of? So sometimes we need to have a bit of a reality check before we start getting too frazzled if we're doing the job first or the move first. So what I will say is pick a country that appeals to you. I had always wanted to visit Australia. I never, ever in a million years anticipated that 6 years later I would be a marketing manager and head coach at a company here in Australia. I would never have guessed it in a million years. But that's why you're on the call today, because I'm going to give you some really powerful tools to create your intention and how to go about actually finding a job that's meaningful for you. Again, if you have any questions or comments as we go through, just feel free to pop them in the chat box and I will answer them as soon as I can. Alrighty, Rue. So before you even start applying, I want you to think about the ideal scenarios in these 3 terms. So good, okay, and not okay. What do I mean by this? Well, you start by setting your intention by outlining what you don't want. So in my case, I knew that there were a few things I definitely didn't want to do. I did not want to work in hospitality. I had done that many, many times. I did not want to work in retail. I didn't particularly enjoy working in a shop. So I had pretty clear list in my mind of things I didn't want to do. And I also felt like I'd rather work for a large company than a small company. So I had some things in my mind of what I didn't want. So I didn't want to work for a tiny company that would be unlikely to be able to sponsor me, for example. And this I actually did in Sydney. Even though I was a little bit reactive, I did have these things in my mind without even knowing it at the time. But now that you know them up front, it's probably going to save you a lot of grief. And then outline or write down the ideal thing or job that you want the most. So like the perfect job. I mean, obviously within reason. So if all your experience is, you've worked in a shop and you want to go straight from that to like project manager on a really big media project, it might not be 100% realistic. But set your intention of what specifically you'd like instead. Would you like to work for a small company doing events in the beauty and fashion sector? Would you like to work as an event coordinator in the wedding industry? Would you like to work in construction for a large company and maybe start somewhere as an apprentice and work your way up and learn about that? So write down as specifically as you can what you'd actually like to do. If you've gone to university and you loved the degree that you did in marketing or economics or whatever it is, find a job or a title that you feel like, yep, if I did this job, I'd be really, really happy. I'd be really happy. And make it sort of a little bit of a stretch, but not impossible. And then list a few in-between options that you'd be quite okay with. So you've already said what you don't want, what wouldn't be okay. You've said, yep, this would be my perfect scenario. And in my case, both in the UK and Australia, I said to myself, okay, well, I'd be happy to do a kind of a temporary admin thing for X many months. I'd be okay to do that for a few months to get into the company. I'd even be happy to work as a PA or a secretary for a short while, for example. So I had a bit of a list of the things that I was like, okay, this would be a short term or an interim thing that I'd be quite happy doing. Now, with my coaching background, I'll tell you why this is really important. Because you need to be prepared to be flexible and realistic. But you also need to be specific in setting your intention, because your brain and who you're showing up as, what people will see when they see you, is your intention. So if you've set a really clear intention that I will, no matter what happens, get into marketing, or I really want to get a type of sales job that's really rewarding. Of course, you need to be flexible. Of course, you need to be realistic and understand that, yes, they may not hire you even if you worked as a sales specialist back in your home country, you may not get recruited as a sales specialist in this new country. But the thing to be mindful of is look for the step underneath the sales specialist. Is that the team coordinator? Who is the person underneath that could be advanced into that role? And the reason I say this is when I worked for the large media company here in Australia, I saw people get promoted from junior to mid to reasonably high up in a matter of 1 to 2 years. My experience from the UK, very similar. If you do your job and you're really good at it, you can actually advance quicker than you think. I know another friend of mine here who came as a backpacker to Melbourne, managed to get sponsored by a company. She started in the reception, worked the reception desk for 5 months, got promoted into marketing, and then got promoted up again within the marketing department. So be really mindful of how you set your intention, because if you have your eye on the thing that you want, you will move towards it, whether you like it or not. Cool. All right. So I know everyone on this call probably doesn't care about marketing, but the whole idea about marketing, so whether you like it or not, when you come to a new country, you are marketing yourself. You are your product. And you're marketing and presenting yourself in a way to get to that ideal job that you want, that we talked about before. So the 5 P's of marketing, which most people who've studied this would know of, I've tweaked them a little bit to relate to what we're talking about today. So again, you'll get all these recordings later. So just listen for now and take in what resonates with you, all right? So the first thing is the product. So in marketing, you talk about products, it could be anything from your smartphone to your shoes to your backpack. But in this case, a product is you and your entire skill set. So the product is you. So you're marketing yourself. And sometimes what helps is if you look at yourself and you almost say, well, if I were a thing or an object, how would I sell myself? How would I promote what I'm good at? How would I promote the benefit of this thing? Being mindful that that thing is you, right? The next one is place. So this is actually more important than people realize, because you can have a great product, a great skill set, a great person, but you move them to a different place. It could be that the language is different. So the place is actually the location you're going to and where you're going to be hanging out and networking. And we're going to talk more about networking later on. But so this is where you hang out, online as well as face-to-face. So it could be, you know, online networking groups. It could be where you spend your time. Now, the product we're not changing the product at all. We're literally taking you from one country to the other, and it changes a lot of things. So it means that you have to look at the product differently. You have to look at the skill set differently. You know, in Scandinavia, it's very important to be punctual. Most jobs are quite important to be punctual, but there are some countries in the world where punctuality is not important at all. So if your product, if part of you is punctuality, and you're just pushing that I'm always punctual, I'm always on time, in some cultures and some roles, maybe flexibility is more important. So you can see how you'd need to highlight possibly different things in the product that is you in order to pitch it to a potential employer. The next one is promotion. So, you know, like you see ads on TV every day, you see, you know, those little things that pop up on Facebook that want to sell you different things, or opt in for webinars like the one you're on right now. So the hook is the hook is the thing that gets someone interested. So what is your hook and special skill that is relevant for this job? So the specific job or the specific industry you're looking to get into, whether that's accounting, anything office related, builder, gardener, I don't really know what your thing is. But how would you promote that? You know, what specific skill do you have that is so good that will fix the problem that this job has? And then price. So price, obviously you can have a really great product, but you know, if Apple charged $20,000 for every iPhone, most people probably couldn't afford an iPhone. So you need to put the price where it's realistic and fair both ways. What the biggest thing I see people fail to do is to research what a fair wage is. And I appreciate when you're new in a new country, and I did this both in the UK and in Australia, I just accepted whatever they said was fair. They said the wage for this role is X pounds or X dollars a month. And I was like, okay, that sounds fair. What you can do though, and some job search sites will actually give you a salary bracket for different types of roles. So do your research if you can, or I see a lot of backpackers in different forums as well, chatting to each other and saying, hey, what's actually the fair wage per hour in this type of industry? You know, are we talking $20, $50, anything like that, right? And the next one is packaging. So how are you packaging and presenting your skill set? So you need to do your research on how to present and package your skill set. It's really, really, really important, because how you present yourself and how you go out and pitch in the market who you are, it's going to make a really, really, really big difference. All right. So that's sort of around the general type of thinking. Now, added to this, before we head into CVs and other details, I want you to be really mindful that you need to be mindful of how you are showing up, who you are being. You need to have a really positive mindset. And the thing I see the most often is that people get really frustrated. People get really angry because the things are not working the way they thought they were going to work, etc. So what I will say is be really, really mindful on how you're showing up, how you're thinking. Stay positive, stay strong, stay focused, and make sure that you have a really, really clear outcome in mind. Because who we are and how we think makes a much bigger difference than you realize to people that you meet. And it's not just about being positive and always smiling. It's about having the focus on what you want, and being as specific as you can, which we'll touch more detail on in the networking area. So on a CV, these are some things that you need to have. Now, this is a big slide with a lot of detail, and most of this wouldn't come as a surprise to you, but I'll go through it quickly here, and you can have a further look a little bit later on in your own time. So the things you got to have in most countries, including Australia, if you are specifically coming to Australia, this is very relevant for you, have a career objective. And this goes for international CVs in general. So have a short description of who you are and what you're looking for in a job. So it could be, you know, I'm a strong self-starter. I really enjoy X, Y, and Z. I'm looking for a part-time job in this specific city that will really help me further develop in my project management skills. That's an example of what that is. And that goes at the top with your name. So you have your name, and then you have your career objective early on in the CV. The other items you can structure a little bit, whatever order you want them, but this is basically the first thing someone's going to see on your CV. So be really mindful of what you put there. The next one is personal and professional traits. So basically who you are and why you're good at what you do. So this can be like, you know, it could be that you're punctual. It can be that you're very detail oriented. It could be, you know, pretty much anything like that. Some countries will put more effort on this than others. So depending where you're going, I wanted to keep it fairly generic so that you can sort of become prepared. But this is basically just bullet points, and try and have examples as well from jobs that you've done, you know, a concrete example of when you know, how punctuality or how your detail orientation really helped. Education is pretty straightforward. So any high school you've gone through, university, higher education, specific tradie degree, whatever it might be. So you'll have that under your education with the name of the school, the degree, or the accreditation you received, the year, date, and month if you want to, but year is most important, when you started and finished. If you want, and if you've studied in a few different countries like I have, you probably want to put the school name and maybe the country and city as well, if you wanted to. Next, we have professional work experience. So we've got here, you know, the employer you worked for, the type of role you did, what country or city it was in, because if you have experience from overseas, it needs to be really clear what job you did in what country, so your future potential future manager can see where you're from. Year and month you started and finished that role, and just some bullet points, short bullet points on what your role included, key achievements. So for example, you know, if you worked in the sales department, you might have helped achieve, you know, a 10% increase in sales over the time you were there, or something like that. So it could be an achievement that you have done as an individual, or it could be an achievement that you've done as a group. Skill summary. So this is usually the area where you'd have your online systems and skills. You know, if you've worked with any specific IT systems, it could be good to highlight that here. If you've worked with a certain sales or marketing or finance methodology that is very common in your field, it might be good to highlight that here as well. If you're reasonably young and starting out your career, it can be very, very good to look at things like volunteer experience. So if you've been volunteering for different organizations, or you did an internship that was unpaid as part of your education, it can be really good to list it here. So just list your organization. Again, if it was in another country, you might want to include that. The type of work that you did, you know, whatever you did to support them, maybe how often you came in as well. And the year that you started and finished with that company, or sorry, that organization. And the last two things are language skills. So you remember at the very beginning, I talked about my experience from the UK. So what we've got here is, you know, actually I got the job in the UK because I had listed on my online profile that I spoke Swedish. And in this case, the Swedish bank that I ended up working for needed a bilingual executive assistant to work with the manager setting up a new office. So if I hadn't listed my language skills, I would have been out of that job. And what I also will add, and I have always done this, and I know colleagues of mine have always done this as well, is list how good you are at that language and be reasonably honest, you know? So if you are fluent, if you have a basic knowledge, if you have working knowledge, so could you speak on the phone and have a sales conversation in that language? I know we have a few Scandinavians on the call. Many of you could probably have that conversation in Swedish and Norwegian. So you might have to say that you have a working knowledge in Norwegian, but you might have a basic knowledge in, say, German or French or Spanish that you learned at school if you haven't spoken it since. And of course, your contact details. And this should also include an address. And even if you've recently arrived somewhere and you're staying in some temporary accommodation or with friends or family, that's perfectly fine to put down. All right. So, and the other thing to remember here is remember to have a clear order within each section. So always sort the things by order of importance. So if you're applying for a specific job, you wouldn't have your entire CV every single time. You might cull it, change it, you might change the wording a little bit. So just make sure that when you do apply for jobs that you update your CV and have a master copy of all the things that you are proficient in. And make sure, I do apologize, I'm getting a warning message here from my webinar system. It looks like the call is going to finish very soon. I will fix this little technical glitch and I will send you all an email with an updated link in the next 2 minutes. My sincere apologies. I don't know why this keeps kicking up. So I will email you all. Keep a lookout in your inbox from MailChimp from me, and you will have the new link very, very soon. I do apologize for this, and I will be back in just a minute.